The Alpha Pack mourned lost pups, until a human Omega arrived with snow, and the Alpha King stood frozen. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Rowan Blackwood stood at the edge of the clearing where the forest opened like a held breath, the snow settling in soft layers that muted every sound. And for the first time in years, the Alpha King had nothing to command, nothing to fix, nothing to promise, because the pack had already done all it could, and still the night had taken more than it gave, leaving behind a quiet so heavy it felt measured in miles rather than minutes. A hush that pressed against the chest like winter air at 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Around him, the wolves moved slowly, heads bowed, shoulders low, their grief disciplined but unmistakable, a shared sorrow carried without howls or blame. Only the steady patience of those who had learned to endure, and Rowan felt the weight of leadership not as power but as presence, the simple requirement to stand and witness when standing was all that remained. He watched as the snow gathered along the ring of stones and the young pines, watched the careful hands smoothing the ground, watched mothers rest their foreheads against the earth as if warmth might rise back through it. And he told himself that the laws of nature were not cruel, only indifferent, yet the thought did nothing to loosen the knot beneath his ribs. The wind shifted from the north, clean and sharp, carrying a scent that did not belong, a human note threaded through frost. And Rowan lifted his gaze just as a figure emerged between the trees, boots crunching softly, breath visible, posture calm without arrogance, a woman wrapped in a simple coat, no emblem, no escort, her dark hair dusted with flakes like stars caught mid-fall. She stopped at the edge of the clearing as if measuring the distance, then stepped forward, unafraid, hands bare despite the cold, carrying nothing but a small bundle of snow cupped carefully as though it mattered. And the wolves noticed, not with alarm, but with curiosity that rippled outward, a collective turning of attention that Rowan felt before he saw. The woman's eyes met his without challenge, steady and sincere, and in that instant he sensed something he could not name, not dominance or defiance, but a quiet alignment, as if the forest itself had leaned closer to listen. She knelt, not to him but to the ground, placing the snow gently, deliberately, as if returning something borrowed, and the air changed, not with spectacle but with meaning, the way a room changes when the right person arrives. Rowan took one step and stopped, his breath caught between inhale and exhale, frozen not by cold but by recognition, because leadership had taught him many lessons, yet none had prepared him for the simple truth unfolding before his eyes, that hope sometimes comes without permission, without promise, without belonging, and still asks to be trusted. And as the snow settled, and the clearing held its silence, the Alpha King remained motionless, understanding at last that the night was not finished. Speaking, Rowan Blackwood did not speak, and the pack did not question his silence, because every wolf present felt the shift, subtle but unmistakable, like the moment just before snowfall thickens and the world prepares to listen instead of move. And the human woman remained kneeling with her palms open against the cold earth, as though she were not asking for permission, but offering understanding. The wind carried her scent again, clean and unfamiliar, not sharp like fear or loud like challenge, but soft, steady, and warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. And Rowan realized that the forest was not reacting to her presence as an intruder, but as an answer arriving late, yet precisely on time. A few steps away, the wolves closest to her lowered their heads, not in submission but in instinctive acknowledgement, the same way they responded to calm water after a storm, and Rowan felt his chest tighten, because control had always been his language, but this moment spoke in something older, quieter, and far harder to command. He watched as the woman brushed snow aside with careful movements, her hands trembling slightly from the cold, but never withdrawing, never hesitating, as though leaving would be the greater danger, and he understood that whatever had brought her here had not been curiosity or coincidence, but resolve. The elders shifted uneasily at the edge of the clearing, their expressions guarded, their bodies angled to protect what little remained of hope, and yet none stepped forward to stop her, because even they sensed that interference would break something fragile and necessary. Rowan took another step, slow enough that the crunch of snow beneath his boots sounded louder than it should have, and the woman lifted her gaze toward him, eyes steady, tired, and sincere, eyes that did not reflect his power back at him, but seemed to recognize the weight behind it. She did not bow, did not flinch, did not reach for him, and the absence of those gestures unsettled him more than defiance ever had, because she was not reacting to the Alpha King, but meeting a man who carried the burden of many lives and too few answers. Around them, the pack held still, breaths measured, tails low, ears attentive, as if waiting for the forest to decide what came next, and Rowan felt the truth settle into him with the certainty of gravity. That leadership sometimes meant allowing the unknown to take one step closer while you stayed exactly where you were. He inhaled slowly, tasting frost and pine and that unfamiliar warmth, and for the first time since the night had begun, he felt something loosen, not relief, not joy, but the fragile beginning of trust, the kind that formed not through dominance, but through presence. The woman finally spoke, her voice quiet, clear, and steady, carrying just far enough to reach him without demanding the attention of the entire pack, and she said that she had followed the snow because it had led her here, that sometimes cold carried memory, and sometimes warmth arrived disguised as loss, and she did not claim to understand wolves or packs or kings, only that leaving would have felt like abandoning something that had already suffered enough. Rowan did not answer right away, because answers belonged to certainty, and he was standing inside something far more delicate, something that asked not for command but for care, and as he removed his gloves and let the cold bite into his palms, he realized that whatever had begun in that clearing would change not only the pack, but the way he understood strength itself. The cold deepened as the minutes passed, yet no one moved to leave, because whatever had drawn them together now held them in place with a quiet authority that did not need to be spoken aloud, and Rowan Blackwood became aware of every breath he took, of the way the forest seemed to breathe with him, slower, steadier, as if waiting to see whether he would choose distance or connection. He turned slightly, not away from the woman but toward the pack, and with a single, subtle motion of his hand, he signaled patience rather than command, a choice that sent a ripple through the wolves as surprising as it was reassuring, because their alpha was not asserting dominance, but granting time. The woman remained kneeling, her posture unchanged, though the snow had soaked through the fabric at her knees, and when she finally shifted, it was only to press her palms more firmly to the ground, as if listening for something beneath the frozen surface that others could not hear. Rowan watched her closely now, noticing details he would have missed in any other moment. The steadiness of her breathing, the way her shoulders relaxed when the pack did not advance, the quiet certainty that seemed to anchor her despite the cold, and he wondered how someone so clearly human could stand in the heart of a place that unsettled even seasoned wolves without showing fear. One of the elders stepped forward at last, his voice measured and respectful as he asked the woman her name and why she had come so far in weather that tested even the strongest among them. And the woman answered without hesitation, saying her name was Elena Carter and that she had followed the snowfall because it reminded her of a promise she had once made to herself, that she would not turn away from grief simply because it was not her own. The simplicity of her words struck Rowan more deeply than any ritual or declaration, because they carried no expectation of reward, only responsibility freely chosen, and he felt something align within him, a recognition that leadership and compassion were not opposing forces but complementary ones. As Elena spoke, a change moved through the clearing, subtle at first, then undeniable, as the air seemed to warm by a degree or two, not enough to melt the snow but enough to soften its edge, and Rowan realized that the pack was responding not to her presence alone, but to the intention behind it, to the absence of fear and the presence of care. He stepped closer now, closing the distance until he stood within arm's reach, and still she did not flinch, her gaze lifting to meet his with calm respect, and in that moment Rowan understood that whatever bond was forming here did not rely on instinct alone but on choice, a choice being made quietly by everyone present. He removed his coat and placed it gently around her shoulders, not as a claim but as protection, a gesture that caused a low murmur to pass through the pack as they lowered themselves to the snow, not in submission to her, but in acknowledgement of what their alpha had recognized, that strength did not always arrive with teeth bared and voice raised, but sometimes with open hands and a willingness to stay. Elena accepted the coat with a nod, her fingers brushing the fabric as if grounding herself, and she closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the cold, the pine, the lingering sorrow, and when she opened them again, there was something new there, not triumph or certainty, but resolve, and Rowan felt the future shift, not dramatically, not violently, but decisively, as if a door had opened that could never be closed again. The clearing remained suspended in that delicate stillness as if time itself had chosen to slow, and Rowan Blackwood became acutely aware of the way the pack watched him now, not for orders but for understanding, because the path forward no longer felt dictated by instinct alone, but by something newly shared. He gestured quietly for the elders to remain where they were, then turned his attention back to Elena Carter, noting how she adjusted the coat around her shoulders not possessively but gratefully, as though accepting warmth without assuming it would last. Snow continued to fall in fine, patient flakes, settling on fur and hair alike, and the forest seemed to draw closer, the branches creaking softly as if leaning in to hear what came next. Rowan asked her to stand, his voice calm, low, and unforced, and she rose slowly, careful not to disturb the ground she had knelt upon, her movements respectful in a way that resonated deeply with wolves who understood the language of territory and care. As she stood, a young wolf edged closer, tentative and curious, its steps light against the snow, and Elena did not reach out, but lowered herself slightly, allowing the space between them to remain safe and chosen, and Rowan felt a flicker of something unexpected, a sense that trust was forming not because it was commanded but because it was permitted. The elders exchanged glances, some wary, some thoughtful, and Rowan knew they were weighing tradition against what their instincts were already telling them, that this human woman did not carry threat, but rather a quiet steadiness that eased the sharpest edges of grief. He invited Elena to walk with him to the center of the clearing, not as a test, but as an inclusion, and she followed at his side, her steps matching his pace, neither rushing nor lagging, and the pack parted naturally to make room, their bodies creating a wide, respectful circle. Rowan spoke then, not loudly, but with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard, explaining that the night had taken much from them, and that mourning did not weaken a pack, but reminded it of what it protected. And as he spoke, he felt Elena's presence beside him like a grounding force, steady and attentive, not seeking attention but offering it. She listened as though every word mattered, and when he finished, she nodded once and said that grief needed witnesses, that loss softened when shared, and that sometimes standing together in the cold was the only way to remind the heart it could still feel warmth. The simplicity of her words spread through the pack like a held breath released, and Rowan saw shoulders ease, tails lift slightly, eyes soften, and he understood that something essential was shifting, not erasing loss, but making space for endurance. He extended his hand, palm open, not as a demand but as an invitation, and after a brief pause, Elena placed her hand in his, her touch firm and warm despite the cold, and the connection sent a subtle ripple through the clearing, not dramatic or overwhelming, but deeply right. The pack responded instinctively, lowering themselves to the snow, not in submission to her, but in recognition of what their alpha had acknowledged, that leadership sometimes meant allowing compassion to lead the way. Rowan held her hand only for a moment, then released it, aware that some bonds formed not through possession but through restraint, and as the snow continued to fall, he knew that the night had not ended in loss alone, but in the quiet beginning of something that would test, change, and ultimately strengthen them all. The snow did not stop, but it softened, drifting slower now as if the forest itself had decided to give them time, and Rowan Blackwood felt the weight in his chest shift from ache to vigilance, because moments like this required care more than certainty. He guided Elena Carter toward the edge of the clearing where the pines offered a natural shelter, not removing her from the pack, but allowing space for breath, and the wolves followed at a respectful distance, their presence steady and quiet, forming a living perimeter that spoke of protection rather than possession. Rowan noticed how Elena's steps remained measured, how she adjusted her pace to match his without effort, and he understood that whatever strength she carried did not seek to lead or to follow but to walk alongside, a balance he had spent years trying to teach others through command alone. As they paused beneath the trees, the air felt slightly warmer, not enough to change the cold, but enough to make it bearable, and Rowan asked her where she had learned to listen the way she did, to grief, to silence, to the space between loss and endurance. Elena considered the question before answering, her voice low and thoughtful, explaining that she had grown up in places where winter stayed longer than expected, where people learned early that survival was not only about strength, but about staying present when leaving would have been easier. She said that snow had always been honest with her, revealing what was hidden while asking nothing in return, and Rowan felt the truth of her words settle into him with quiet force, because leadership had taught him to endure storms, but not always to listen to what they revealed. Behind them, the elders watched closely, their expressions a careful blend of caution and curiosity, and Rowan knew they were reading him as much as they were reading her, searching for signs of recklessness or weakness, and finding instead a steadiness they could not easily argue with. He turned back toward the clearing and raised his voice just enough to carry, speaking of rest and warmth, of honoring the night by allowing bodies and hearts to recover, and the pack responded immediately, some shifting toward the dens, others lingering to watch Elena with softened eyes, and Rowan sensed that something irreversible had taken root. Elena glanced toward the wolves, then back to Rowan, and asked quietly if staying would be a burden, if her presence would disrupt what the pack needed to heal, and Rowan answered without hesitation that healing rarely came from isolation, that sometimes the presence of an outsider reminded a community of what it had forgotten to offer itself. He offered her a place by the fire, not as a guest passing through, but as someone whose choice to remain mattered, and Elena accepted with a nod that carried both gratitude and resolve. As they walked back toward the heart of the territory, Rowan felt the subtle awareness at the edge of his senses deepen, a pull that was not urgent or demanding, but patient, as if something ancient had recognized her and was content to wait. He knew better than to name it too quickly, knew that bonds formed best when allowed to grow without pressure, and yet he could not deny the way his instincts had shifted, not toward claiming, but toward guarding, not toward possession, but toward responsibility. The fire came into view, its glow steady against the snow, and as Elena warmed her hands, Rowan stood beside her, aware that the pack watched them together now, not with suspicion, but with a cautious hope that mirrored his own. The night had not erased their loss, but it had changed the way it sat among them, and Rowan understood that whatever followed would require patience, trust, and a willingness to redefine strength, and as the snow continued to fall beyond the firelight, he accepted that the path ahead had already begun to unfold. The fire crackled softly, its warmth pressing back against the cold without erasing it, and Rowan Blackwood remained standing while the pack settled, his attention divided between the quiet rhythms of his territory and the human woman warming her hands beside the flames. Elena Carter did not speak at first, and Rowan respected the silence, because he understood now that her presence carried meaning even when unspoken, and the wolves sensed it too, their breathing evening out, their bodies easing as though a long-held tension had finally found a place to rest. Snow continued to fall beyond the ring of light, outlining the trees in white and silver, and Rowan felt the night stretching on, no longer sharp with grief, but steady with watchfulness. One by one, the pack members moved closer to the fire, not crowding Elena but acknowledging her as part of the shared space, and Rowan noticed how naturally she adjusted, shifting slightly to allow room, her movements guided by awareness rather than instruction. He spoke quietly then, asking if the journey here had been difficult, and Elena answered honestly, saying that the cold had been harsh and the path uncertain, but that she had learned to trust small signs, the direction of the wind, the way snow settled, the feeling of when to stop and when to continue. Rowan listened, recognizing a familiar discipline in her words, one he had always associated with wolves rather than humans, and the realization unsettled and intrigued him in equal measure. An elder approached, his tone respectful but firm, asking what Elena intended to do when the morning came, whether she would leave once the storm eased, and the question drew the attention of the entire pack, their ears lifting, their bodies angling subtly toward her response. Elena did not rush to answer, and Rowan felt the weight of that pause, because choices made here would ripple outward, shaping how the pack remembered this night. She said that she had not come with a plan to take anything, only with the intention to stay as long as she was welcome, to offer what she could, and to leave when it was clear her presence was no longer needed. Her words carried neither entitlement nor apology, only clarity, and Rowan felt something settle into place within him, a sense that leadership was sometimes about recognizing when an offer was being made freely, without expectation. He met the elder's gaze and nodded once, signaling acceptance, and the pack responded with a collective easing, as if a decision they had all been waiting for had finally been voiced. As the night deepened, Rowan found himself aware of Elena in a new way, not as a question or an anomaly, but as a steady presence that sharpened his attention rather than distracting it, and he realized that his instincts had shifted from vigilance to consideration. He sat at last, taking a place across from her, the firelight reflecting in her eyes, and for a moment neither spoke, content to share the quiet. Rowan understood then that whatever bond was forming did not demand immediate naming, that some connections grew strongest when allowed to remain undefined, shaped by time and shared experience rather than declaration. The pack began to settle into rest, some curling near the fire, others retreating to the shadows, and Rowan remained awake, listening to the forest, to the wind, to the subtle harmony that had returned to his territory. Elena drew her coat closer, her expression calm, resolved, and Rowan felt a deep certainty take root, not as a claim or a promise, but as an understanding that the night had marked them both, and that when dawn arrived, it would find the pack changed, not because loss had been undone, but because something gentler and more enduring had been allowed to remain. The night thinned slowly toward morning, the fire burning lower but steadier, and Rowan Blackwood felt the subtle change before he saw it. The way the forest exhaled as though a long vigil was ending, and with that exhale came a quiet alertness that sharpened his senses. Elena Carter stirred beside the fire, adjusting the coat around her shoulders, and Rowan noticed how naturally she rose and moved, as if she had always known how to occupy shared space without claiming it. A soft sound carried from the tree-line, not a threat but a signal, the kind that spoke of attention rather than alarm, and several wolves lifted their heads at once, ears angling, eyes brightening with cautious hope. Rowan followed their gaze and felt his breath catch, because the ground near the clearing had shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably, a subtle disturbance beneath the snow that had not been there before. He stepped forward slowly, raising a hand to still the pack, his heart steady but intent, and Elena moved with him, her expression focused, respectful of the moment unfolding. The snow thinned where the earth had been warmed by shared presence and patience, and Rowan realized that what he was witnessing was not reversal but response, the land answering care with possibility. A faint movement drew closer to the surface, tentative and uncertain, and the wolves held their breath as if afraid to hope too loudly, and Rowan felt the weight of every life he was sworn to protect settle into him with renewed clarity. Elena knelt again, her movements careful, deliberate, her hands hovering just above the snow as if offering reassurance rather than interference, and Rowan saw the pack mirror her restraint, their bodies coiled but calm, trusting him to decide what came next. He crouched beside her, close enough to feel the warmth she carried, and for a moment neither spoke, sharing the silence that felt both fragile and strong. The ground shifted again, and a small shape pressed upward, not with force but with persistence, and Rowan felt a low murmur ripple through the pack, not celebration, but awe tempered by respect for what had been lost and what might yet endure. He understood then that this was not a moment for command or claim, but for witness, and he remained still, allowing the forest to complete what care had begun. Elena glanced at him briefly, her eyes searching not for permission but for alignment, and he nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and the connection between them felt like a quiet bridge forming, sturdy and unspoken. As the movement stilled, the pack leaned in collectively, their presence protective rather than possessive, and Rowan felt the night release its final hold, replaced by the pale promise of dawn. He rose slowly, his posture calm and grounded, and addressed the pack in a voice meant to carry reassurance rather than triumph. reminding them that patience had value, that care could change outcomes without erasing loss, and that strength was measured not only in what was taken but in what was preserved. The wolves responded not with sound but with stillness, a shared understanding settling among them, and Rowan felt the territory accept the moment, marking it quietly into memory. Elena remained kneeling, her breath steady, her presence unwavering, and Rowan knew with deep certainty that whatever bond had formed this night was not bound by instinct alone but by choice. And as the first light edged over the trees, he understood that the pack had not simply endured the night, but had been changed by it, guided by a human Omega who had arrived without promise and stayed with care, and by an Alpha King who had learned that sometimes standing frozen was the first step toward leading forward. The dawn spread slowly across the clearing, pale light threading through the trees and settling on snow that now seemed less severe, and Rowan Blackwood felt the territory wake with him, alert but calm, as though the forest itself had accepted what the night had shaped. The pack remained gathered, not crowding, not dispersing, their bodies angled toward the center where Elena Carter still knelt, and Rowan recognized the posture immediately, a communal readiness that did not demand instruction. He moved closer, his steps deliberate, and extended a hand to Elena, not to pull her up but to offer balance, and she accepted, rising with a steady breath that matched his own. As she stood, the wolves adjusted their stances, tails lifting slightly, ears forward, a collective acknowledgement that carried no spectacle and needed none. Rowan spoke quietly, naming the morning, naming rest, naming the work that would follow, and his words were practical, measured, grounded in care rather than command, and the pack listened as they always had. Yet now there was a new undercurrent, an attentiveness that included Elena without question. She stood at his side, not elevated, not hidden, simply present, and Rowan felt the subtle alignment deepen, the sense that leadership had expanded rather than shifted, making room without losing shape. An elder approached and offered a simple nod to Elena, then another followed, and then a third, not as ceremony but as recognition, and Rowan understood the significance, because elders did not offer acknowledgement lightly. Elena returned each nod with quiet respect, her posture open, her gaze attentive, and Rowan saw the pack respond to that exchange with a softening that spread outward like warmth from the fire. He addressed the group again, stating plainly that Elena would remain for the day, that she would be given space and support, and that the pack would move forward together, and there was no dissent, only a steady acceptance that felt earned rather than imposed. As the wolves began to shift into the rhythms of morning, Rowan remained with Elena, guiding her toward the path that led deeper into the territory, not to seclusion but to belonging, and she walked beside him without hesitation, her steps confident yet considerate. He felt the bond between them settle into something clearer now, not urgent or overwhelming, but unmistakable, a quiet recognition that required no declaration. To be real, they passed beneath branches heavy with snow, and Rowan noticed how the forest seemed to open rather than resist, as if acknowledging her presence as something that fit. Elena spoke softly then, thanking him for trust rather than shelter, and Rowan replied that trust was not given but recognized, and the exchange felt complete, needing nothing more. As they reached a rise overlooking the clearing, Rowan paused and looked back, taking in the sight of the pack moving together with renewed purpose, and he felt a calm certainty anchor within him, the knowledge that leadership was not diminished by compassion but clarified by it. He turned back to Elena and placed his cloak more securely around her shoulders, not as a claim but as a promise of protection that respected her autonomy, and she met his gaze with a steady calm that mirrored his own. The morning continued to brighten, the snow easing into a quiet backdrop rather than a barrier, and Rowan understood that what had been recognized here would echo forward, shaping decisions yet to come. He did not name it, did not rush it, but he allowed it to exist, the shared understanding between an Alpha King and a human Omega that strength could be gentle, that care could lead, and that sometimes the most powerful recognition was the one spoken only through action. The day settled fully into the territory, light resting on snow and stone alike, and Rowan Blackwood stood at the overlook longer than he had intended, not because he was hesitant, but because he understood that endings deserved the same care as beginnings. Below them, The pack moved with quiet purpose, tending to one another, restoring order without urgency, and Rowan felt a steady pride take shape, not sharp or triumphant, but calm, rooted in continuity. Elena Carter stood beside him, her posture relaxed yet attentive, as though she understood that this moment mattered not because of what had happened, but because of what it allowed to continue. Rowan turned toward her then, fully, and spoke with the measured clarity he reserved for truths he intended to honor, telling her that she had been recognized by the pack, not as a guest, not as an exception, but as someone whose presence had altered the way they faced loss, and that recognition carried responsibility as well as respect. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful, and when she replied, she did not accept the words lightly, saying that she did not seek a place taken from others, only one earned through care, and Rowan felt the certainty of that response settle between them like a foundation laid without ceremony. He told her that care was the oldest measure of belonging, older than blood, older than rank, and that the pack had responded because she had not tried to claim anything, only to remain, and in that remaining had offered something rare. The wind moved through the trees, gentle now, carrying the clean scent of snow that had begun to soften, and Rowan felt the land affirm the exchange, not with signs or symbols, but with ease. He reached out then, not to claim her hand, but to rest his palm briefly at her back, a guiding touch meant to communicate direction rather than possession, and together they began the slow walk back toward the heart of the territory, their steps naturally aligned. As they passed through the clearing one last time, the pack paused, not to stare, but to acknowledge, heads lifting, bodies stilling, and Rowan spoke a single sentence meant for all of them, reminding them that strength endured when it learned to be gentle, and that what they protected together would shape who they became. There was no response in sound, only a shared understanding that moved through the group like a held breath released, and Rowan knew that the lesson would carry forward long after the snow melted. Elena stopped at the edge of the path, looking back once more at the clearing, then turned to Rowan and said quietly that she would stay as long as she was needed, and leave when the pack no longer required her presence. And Rowan answered that sometimes staying and leaving were not opposites, but parts of the same promise, honored over time rather than decided in a moment. He offered her a place to rest, a space to belong without obligation, and she accepted with a nod that carried both trust and resolve. As they walked on, Rowan felt the future unfold not as a demand but as an invitation, one that would require patience, listening, and restraint, and he accepted it without fear. The territory seemed to recognize the choice, the path opening easily beneath their feet, and Rowan understood that what had begun with loss had resolved into something quieter and more enduring, a shared direction rather than a single declaration. He did not name the bond forming between them, because names could wait, but he honored it in action, in presence, in the steady commitment to protect what mattered, and as the snow continued to fall lightly around them, Rowan Blackwood knew with calm certainty that the pack would remember this day not as the end of mourning, but as the moment they learned how to carry hope forward.